Well, good evening, and thanks for everybody being here. I want to thank the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for asking me here today. And my hope, I think the committee's hope, I would guess, for everybody here today is at the end of the day, after watching the Phoenix Drum and Dance Group, after listening to the speakers and the rising MCs, that we all gain experiences today and gain knowledge that maybe we didn't have before we came here today. So with that, I wanted to tell a little bit of history about Juneteenth, what it was, what it wasn't, and hopefully end on a little note of hope for tomorrow based on a personal story of mine. So we're celebrating Juneteenth, something that happened in 1865 that prior to Juneteenth, we had spent centuries basically brainwashing ourselves in this country about black people and many other groups, but since it's Juneteenth, we'll keep the black people, where doctors and scientists and pastors, and I don't mean fringe doctors and fringe scientists, I mean well-renowned doctors and scientists and very popular pastors, preached that black people were less than. They preached that they were savages. If you've ever heard a black person called a monkey or an ape, it came from slavery times where doctors said black people were the closest to the animal kingdom, very similar to monkeys or apes. So I'm pretty sure probably everybody here has heard a black person called a monkey or ape, so we still use language from slavery time in the 16 and 1700s. And pastors preached that God made black people to be slaves. And so any resistance or fighting against that is not just an offense against the slave master, but it's also an offense against God. So even white people that preached that black people shouldn't be slaves were punished and were offending God, according to the pastor. So this went on for 200 years before Juneteenth ever occurred. And Juneteenth is a day that was 2 months after the Civil War ended. It was almost 2 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that the last black slaves in Texas were notified by a Union general that they were free. Again, that was 2 months after the Civil War. And as a matter of fact, not all black slaves were free on Juneteenth. There were still slaves in Native American territories held by Native American tribes. And the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states that were in the Confederacy, the states that were fighting against the Union. The states that weren't part of the Confederacy still had slaves on Juneteenth. Delaware, Kentucky, the border states, still, because the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to Confederate states. It did not apply to other people. So we're here today to celebrate Juneteenth, what it was and what it wasn't. So it was written on a piece of paper that the institution of slavery was over, but it didn't address what I just talked about for 200 years, that we had convinced ourselves, all of us, that black people were less than. And because that was never addressed, because it was only written on a piece of paper that the institution of slavery must end, we found more ways, additional ways, for hundreds and hundreds of years, still to this day, to continue to either do an institution of slavery or discriminate. So shortly after the Civil War, if you think about a person owns a plantation, a coal mine, a factory, basically work that is done by enslaved people. And then one day the Civil War is over and they can't do that anymore. So how do they farm their plantations? How do they work their mines? How do they work their factories without this free labor that they had had for well over 200 years? So because then the 13th Amendment was passed that said you can't enslave people unless they're convicted of a crime. So we need labor. We need our plantations farmed. We need our cotton picked. We need our coal mines worked. And so we instituted things called the Black Code that applied to black people only. You couldn't be in a city without a job. That was a crime. You couldn't meet as a group without a white person. That's a crime. You couldn't leave the job site without a written piece of paper. In some laws, in some black codes, it still said without written permission from your master after the Civil War. So we found a new way to enslave people. Black people would be walking down the street, and the whole government participated. Somebody would say that black person committed a crime, which oftentimes they had not. The sheriff arrests them, take them to the judge convicts them within hours with no evidence, and then fines them, say, $50. The judge gets some money, the sheriff gets some money, everybody gets some money. The plantation owner comes and pays the $50 bill and enslaves the black person for a year or a year and a half. And as soon as their time is coming up, they trump up a new charge. They charge again, now they have them for another year. Sometimes this was called convict leasing, and everybody profited from it. The sheriff, the judge, the lawmakers, not just law enforcement, everybody. Everybody, and not just in the South. Black codes were in the North too. And so because we never dealt with the underlying causes and things that allowed slavery to persist for over 200 years, we found new ways to do it. And eventually, when that went away, we continued to use discrimination, redlining, which oftentimes when I speak about these things, because I've lived in Sacramento my whole life, in California my whole life, I'm usually speaking here in California, and people tell me that didn't happen in California. That was only in the South. That was a long time ago. It's only in the South. Get over it. Well, I hate to tell you this, but it all happened here. We had slaves in Sacramento during the gold rush and other times. We had redlining. Oak Park is a product of redlining, not because Oak Park, where I grew up, was redlined, but when we tore the redlined area down, we sent all the black families to Oak Park. And then we destroyed all the businesses in Oak Park. Same thing in Del Paso Heights. So some of the things we do today still come from what we believed about certain groups of people. And now we hear things like, and I never used the term CRT, although I'm using it right now because I hear like 8 different definitions of what CRT is. I just call it history. It's our history, all of our history, not just some of our history. And so when I talk about this in California, what I usually hear, like I said, is that didn't happen here and basically be quiet. We didn't have that here. That's in the South. It was a long time ago. Problem is, it wasn't only in the South, and it's right now, in new ways. So we have to talk about it. That's why events like this are so important, because if we're going to make tomorrow better for all of us, we need to know how we got here. So I want to give a personal story of how that plays out and how we can fight against it. And I always say it's more about the heart and mind than it is laws. Laws should support what our mind and heart want. They always have. So when we had slavery, we had laws that said slavery was okay and legal because our hearts and minds wanted slavery to be illegal. And so I was a product of my biological mother is white from Humboldt, and my biological father is black from Shreveport, Louisiana. And they met at, there we go, there's some Louisiana in the house. I wasn't born in Louisiana, but they met in college at Humboldt in the late 60s. And I don't know how this happens, but somehow my biological mother became pregnant. I'm still not sure how that occurred. She came to Sacramento and gave birth to me at Mercy Hospital. And there's some more shout-outs for Mercy. Later, as I found out who everybody was, I learned what I believe says that my biological mother was not too keen on people that looked like me. So I would guess that's part of the reason why she, in secret, came down to Sacramento, gave birth to me without them knowing, gave me up for adoption, and went home. So I would guess that part of me is why I am where I am is partly because of these beliefs that we have about black people. Fortunately, my mom and dad adopted me when I was 3 months old. On paper, they would look like the most unlikely people to adopt a black child. My mom is white from Painesville, Minnesota. If you Google that now, it's 1,200 people. There are no black people there now. First time she saw a black person was she was a teenager, about 15 or 16 years old, with Rust College, which was a historically black college from Mississippi, was traveling across the country. They were founded by the Lutheran Church, performing. And so they were performing in Painesville. My grandmother, who was a music teacher, brought them over to the farmhouse for lunch. That's the first time my mom ever saw a black person. They didn't have TVs. My mom was born in 1939. And just also to give you some perspective, Do you know what year in our country it was legal for a black person to marry outside of their race nationally in our country? The Loving versus Virginia case. Does anybody know what year that was? It was the year before I was born. It wasn't that long ago. 1967. So a year before I was born, my mom, white, my dad, black, created me. It wasn't even legal for them to be married. It happened in by the way, in case you want to know when it was legalized in California, it was 1948. It was legal in California. So before 1948, a black person couldn't marry a non-black person in our state, in California. So my mom is white from Painesville, Minnesota. My dad is white from Nebraska. And they both adopted me. Unfortunately, my dad died when I was 5 and raised me in Oak Park on the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue. My mom is the greatest person I've ever met. And because her heart and mind did not believe the things that we were brainwashed to believe for centuries, she adopted me and cared for Oak Park as if she had lived there her whole life and allowed me to rise up and not only be the first black police chief in Roseville, but the first black police officer in Roseville ever in 2011. Imagine that. 2011, Roseville had never had a black police officer. Now you can ask yourself this. Is it because there was no black people that were qualified to be police officers, or is it because of something else? So Sacramento is over 170 years old. And in 2017, I was the first black police chief. Now, is that because there was no black officers qualified to be police chief? Or is it for something else? And so we all have to understand how we got here, and we all have to take, all of us, just like all of us created our country the way it is now, we all have to decide this is not right. And today, and learning history and understanding how we got here is a huge part of that. So I thank all of you for being here. I hope that everybody here will get to understand why things are the way they are. Because when I talk to people about why Oak Park is the way it is, and quite frankly, growing up in Oak Park, I always thought Oak Park was like that. I never knew Oak Park was any different than what it was when I grew up there. One of the most crime-riddled neighborhoods in the city, but a neighborhood I loved growing up in. I had a blast growing up. I wasn't scared to go outside. We played football and basketball all the time. But prior to me, not too long prior to me being born and living there, Oak Park was a thriving neighborhood, an upper middle class neighborhood with thriving businesses. But most people think that Oak Park, when I talk to people, they say Oak Park's that way because there's no fathers. There's violent people there. That goes back to what I just told you in the 1600s, 1700s. And there's people that if they just get a job, they would be so much better. But the reality is we created Oak Park. We, human beings. We changed Oak Park from a thriving neighborhood to what we see today. And it's actually now recovering for many reasons. But we destroyed the businesses in Oak Park by building Highway 99 on purpose to drive the outskirts of town to the redeveloped ex-redlined area of the West End downtown. And we were the first in the country to use tax increment financing, which means you pay back your loans that you redevelop the area with taxes from that area. So when I go shopping downtown back in the 50s and 60s when it happened, I'm paying back those loans. So the city wants people to shop in that area. We're the first in the country to do that. The rest of the country copied Sacramento, California. So all these neighborhoods, Elk Grove, Sacramento, when I was a kid and younger, they didn't look like they look now. And there was a reason for that. We weren't allowed to live here. And now we have to understand that that's how that created that way, not what we believe that, well, they're just lazy people, they're violent people. No, we created the poverty. And if we ever want to turn around the violence that we see, we can pass gun laws, all that's good. Some gun laws are very appropriate. But if we want to do it long term, we have to address the poverty that we created. And so that's why I love Juneteenth, because it's history, and and our history keeps repeating itself because we don't know how we got here. So I hope all of you have learned something and will continue to learn with the other two speakers, and maybe even spark some more research to do on your behalf of how we got here. And so, because only if we know how we got here can we change that. So thank you all for being here. It's been my pleasure speaking with you. And I'll turn it back over to the right.